Can you share more about your story? You said, you're an example of this in the environmental factors leading to same-sex attraction. And then you also shared you've talked to now hundreds of other people and know now their stories. What are some more of those environmental factors?
Okay, so for me personally, there were things that I noticed a lot in my clients as well. So I'm going to share a little bit about my story, but also kind of generalize it to the things I've seen as a pattern. I know that I was exposed early on to things that inhibited my ability to respond well to emotions. So let's say a family environment that does not adequately know how to reflect a child and corrects them instead. So what I mean by that is not you shouldn't correct somebody's behavior, but this is something that's very prominent in family therapy too. We call it emotion coaching parenting. We want to promote parenting that reflects children's emotional experiences back to them instead of corrects them for the feelings that they're having. So for instance, as a boy, I was more sensitive and a little bit prone towards perfectionism and maybe a little bit more effeminate and a little bit more artistic and creative. And my father, whom I love, who I have a very good relationship with as an adult, was very different than me. We had very different temperaments, different personalities. And we struggled, I think, when I was young to really connect in a way that I could internalize a sense that I'm a boy because I'm like dad. And that sense of gender insecurity, I did not have gender identity problems, but gender insecurity became especially prominent by the time I hit early elementary school, because boys tend to notice when a boy is insecure, and then they can become prey to other bullies who pounce on that insecurity. So I began getting bullied when I was very young. And I think that reinforced my sense of insecurity. And I didn't turn to my dad. I turned often to my mom for comfort. So then I was in the realm of the feminine where I was like safe and nurtured and things were really easy. But the problem with that is eventually that creates a sense of isolation between me and the same-sex peers I longed to connect with. Because every boy wants to have attention, affection, approval, affirmation, admiration from their same-sex peers. And that time period, especially early elementary school, you need that to launch you into adolescence, where you're then kind of sent forth from your same-sex peer group towards the other, the mysterious other. But for me, the other was not mysterious. It was my realm of safety. Does that make sense?
The other meaning the feminine,
yeah,
as
the feminine,
masculine.
right.
So the feminine wasn't mysterious and alluring. The feminine was the safe place. And what was mysterious and even dangerous was the masculine, even though you were the masculine.
Right, but not attentive to that reality within myself. And I even defensively began detaching from my dad, resenting him at an early age because I didn't understand him and didn't know how to connect. And I say this not blaming my parents. My parents are amazing. Some of this is also just the reality of the messiness of life, and that wounds happen often unintentionally, and no one's immune from wounds in their life. And we're not here to blame. We're just going to name things that I think contributed in my story. But add to that, there was, and this is, something really important to be nuanced about, but exposure to things that I should not have seen or participated in at an early age due to somehow just being accidentally exposed to other children who knew things they shouldn't have known, or done things they shouldn't have done, or had done to them things that shouldn't have been done to them. And those things primed me for sexualizing attachments that I longed for with men at a very early age. It didn't emerge fully, though, until I was in my adolescent period when puberty hits and all the hormones rush in, which sexualize the body and the person. Well, unmet attachment needs gravitate very strongly towards powerful, pleasurable pulls. And one of those is the drive for sexual pleasure and connection, which is innate to every person. So that's a little bit about my story.
How does sexual abuse and sexual exposure at an early age, how can that have an impact on someone who might then struggle with sexual attraction, same-sex sexual attraction?
Yeah. And what's really great about that angle we're looking at here is that even mainstream American Psychological Association have talked about research studies that even indicate potential causal factors. We're not talking about correlative even, potential causal factors of same-sex sexual abuse in childhood and same-sex partnering in adulthood. So we know, and your listeners, I dare them to go look at the research. It's easily available online. Study after study show men who have sex with men, and that's a term used in research because the term gay is really cultural. It's not really a research term. But men who have sex with men have statistically higher rates of sexual abuse in childhood astronomically higher than men who do not struggle with this issue. Astronomically higher. Some studies 5 times as high, some more. And we think those numbers, many of us in this field, are even low because due to the clients we work with and people we know, a lot of things that have happened to men who have sex with men in childhood, they don't even see as abuse, especially if it happened in adolescence when they were sexually more mature and it was somebody who was maybe just over the age of 18 or 21. Would it be illegal and would be considered abuse, but they didn't see it as such because they were groomed by somebody who seemed safe or led to their sexual awakening. So it's a serious problem. And one of the things that it does is it sexualizes a longing for something deeper than sexuality, that affirmation longing. I long to be affirmed as a man, to be congruent with my sexual identity as a man. And I'm not feeling that from, let's say, my peers or as adequately as I need from my primary father figure. So this person, this boy, now has given me attention in a way that is sexualized and it feels good. Well, it's some people call a fraudulent attachment or some kind of false attachment. It seems good. And many boys get this through exposure to pornography. And not just men with same-sex attraction, Lila. Men who are longing for connection and stumble upon internet porn. Average age of exposure, I've seen studies say, is 8 to 11 years old. So it's not just an issue for men with same-sex attraction. But I will say even boys who are not in the past probably predisposed towards same-sex attraction can be conditioned towards other sexual issues due to the content in pornography that sexualizes their brains towards bizarre or unhealthy models of sexual arousal templates is the word a lot of people like to use.
There's so many questions I have. And again, I can't thank you enough, Michael, for talking about all of these things because it's so powerful and important and being willing to share your story and obviously your clinical work too. But okay, wanted to start with one thing that you just said, which was there are these studies that show that men who have sex with men 5 times or more likely to have been abused as children.
Yep.
And I want to probe a little deeper into that because why is that? Why is it that child sexual abuse is often part of the history of those who experience same-sex attraction? And I want to say one more thing with that. I remember researching this over the past few years for different reasons, and I found a justification for this not being evidence that sexual abuse is responsible for same-sex attraction, but instead that if you are a gay kid, you're more likely to be sexual abused. You see the sleight of hand there? So the pro sort of LGBTQ identity crowd says, well, that data just shows that gay children are vulnerable to sexual abuse at higher rates than straight children. And so it's no surprise that later on, men who have sex with men have a higher rate of sexual abuse in their childhoods.
I mean,
that's the
argument. It's a specious argument, I think, because what is a gay child? What does that mean? Child are not sexually active. So a 5 or 6 year old child is just a boy or a girl. So they would say, well, the child who's, the boy who is going to be same-sex attracted or maybe has early same-sex attraction is more of a target, a soft target for a predator. Well, so what I'm trying to redefine the terms here. So why are you calling, not you, but these arguments are calling that child gay? Why are you even saying that? If they're not, what defines someone as gay? If they're 5 years old, they don't have sexual attractions yet. They might have draws or pulls or attractions towards the same sex in a friendship manner or towards women or girls in a friendship manner or aversion from women or girls in a friendship manner. But we know sexual feelings do not emerge fully until puberty. So again, what defines gay? We should define our terms. If you're saying this is a boy who might develop into a homosexual boy, so you're going to call him pre-homosexual, that's very different. That just means he has certain personality traits or tendencies, or maybe he's less masculinized, less assertive. Well, I would argue that often happens most commonly when this child is not as securely attached to their same-sex parent figure. Now, we also don't have to know perfect causality to say that when correlation is that high, we should at least be curious and not provide reductive, overly simplistic answers. And I think to say that, that correlation is that high, it is simply because that child is gay. One, you're not defining gay. And gay is really a cultural identity. It's not a definition of feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And children deserve to not be sexualized through an adult lens. We are sexualizing young people through an adult lens when we say things like that.
So when you encounter someone who has child sexual abuse as part of their history, and now they're struggling with same-sex attraction, how do you approach that in a clinical setting?
And that's one of many things we address. So I want to, before I answer that question, say, I'm not saying everybody who is identifying as gay or has same-sex attraction was abused. And I'm not saying I know everyone's story. We're talking about trends, general issues, and the need to be curious and be attentive to people's stories so that we can try to get them the help that they need. I'll give you an example of a person that I worked with. And as a therapist, this is an anonymized version of a story where some of the details have been changed to protect the identity of my clients. But I worked with a man once who was married to a woman with a family, with children. And this man came to therapy because he was Christian and very devout, but had compulsive sexual behaviors where he would look at homosexual pornographic images and engage in compulsive sexual behaviors on his own at home through masturbation. And this was obviously a problem. It was a problem because it didn't fit with his morals. It did not fit with his ideal for his marriage. And he knew it was hurting his relationship with his wife. And yet he found it enjoyable, but also felt like he couldn't resist it. And he also hated it and he had shame about it. Okay, so he comes to therapy for what he says is just same-sex attraction, right? He does not come to therapy for sexual abuse. That's not his stated conflict. But what we do in a situation like that is we foster curiosity, openness, receptivity. We do not shame people. We encourage them to accept themselves just as they are, radically in the midst of whatever their behaviors or feelings are, even if they don't like them or wish they were different. And through that self-acceptance journey, we begin looking at what are the moments where he's most likely to engage in this compulsive behavior. So for this client, it might have been when he's feeling kind of weak or not very masculine or inadequate as a father. In that case, he was most prone to getting on the internet and looking at images that triggered that sense of that false attachment security. Here's this other person, this man in this image that I feel connected to now. It's an illusion. It's not real. So that's why it's a counterfeit attachment. It's not a real attachment. But in looking at that moment, using reintegrative therapy in this man's case, we just foster reflection. So what we do is we check in with the body. We see what sensations, distress, disturbance, feelings in the body are coming up for you right at that peak moment where you're most tempted to engage in this behavior. And many of our clients feel distress, tension, tightness, fear. So we go with that. Okay, what does that remind you of? We use standard evidence-based trauma techniques like what we call an EMDR, a float back. EMDR is a evidence-based trauma treatment for talk therapists. And in this float back, we say, what does this tension and discomfort in your body remind you of in your past? And we let the mind and the Holy Spirit hopefully guide it. And this man's mind went right back to childhood sexual abuse. Whereas a 5-year-old, he was systematically abused and groomed by an educator. Okay? He didn't even identify that in his adult life as abuse. Because many times it's impossible to reconcile the complex combination of pleasure and affirmation a child feels when being groomed and abused by a known family friend. And so they can't reconcile that. So they just think it was something that happened to them. But shortly after that abuse happened, Lila, he began enacting, and this is in the field of sexual addiction therapy called trauma reenactment. He began reenacting those exact same behaviors with peers his own age, starting as early as 8 or 9 years old, and then through high school. And then when he was able to eventually resolve not acting out in person, but the behaviors went underground to pornography and masturbation. Well, through the trauma reprocessing we did with that man, we brought in mindful self-compassion, how he could see himself as a child, as a victim. It was the first time in his life he was able to identify he was a victim of abuse. We can help him by God's grace. All healing comes from God. None of this is without God, right? God is the source of all healing, medical, psychological, spiritual healing. We could identify a new narrative, though. What happened to him? How can he make sense of it? We use trauma reprocessing methods, in this case, mindful self-compassion, where the man visualizes loving, caring for, protecting his younger self in a way that nobody protected or could protect at the time. And this reduced the vividness, emotionality, distress. It provided a new narrative for these foundational trauma memories that influence the trajectory of his sexual feelings and behaviors into adulthood. Okay, so we do that and we go back to the peak trigger moment. All of a sudden, that peak trigger moment where he's most tempted in his current present state to go back to those compensatory behaviors, he sees with a new perspective. he feels less distress. He feels less need to self-regulate with his inadequacy as a man by using an external counterfeit attachment, and more able to see himself as a man for who he is as a survivor of abuse, and also to foster other healthier relationships in his life. So he began working on men's groups. He started going to men's retreats to connect more positively with peers. And that is a great example of a client who left therapy before his healing was done. I know he went on to other therapists. I know he kept going on to seek healing through support groups. But he, in the time I accompanied him, was able to see God's healing work in his life as an ongoing journey. And I was just graced to be able to accompany and witness it. I'm just a facilitator. I'm not the healer.